Welcome, everyone. I'm Sandy Boyd, the CEO and co-founder of Seek Common Ground. Thank you for joining us today for today's talk, Victories from the Front Lines, LGBTQ+ Student Changemakers. For those of you who are new to Seek Common Ground talks, welcome. I encourage you to take a look at our website, learn more about us. Always feel free to reach out. We are happy to answer any questions that you have. Today, our talk is focused on work from Seek Common Ground's Student Action Network for Equity, or SANE, where we convene and support student organizations advancing racial justice, equity, and democracy, including support for LGBTQ+ students' rights. In just over a year, SANE has grown to 55 groups operating in 24 states and Washington, D.C., and through a participatory funding process where students are decision makers, we've provided over $500,000 in funding to student organizations. For today's talk, we'll be joined by LGBTQ+ student changemakers, Mateo, Mishi, and Cheaton. You can find out more about them in the chat. Their bios are there. I encourage you to look into more information about them and their really amazing organizations. The talk today will be moderated by Lydia Burns, our Youth and Community Partner Manager at Seek Common Ground. Originally, you might have seen that Alex Ames, the co-founder of the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition and Seek Common Ground Fellow, was going to moderate, but she had an exam today that she couldn't reschedule. And that's really the first rule of working with students. They're students, and flexibility is key. So finally, a few logistics before we get started. Please submit questions for the panel using the Q&A function. Like all of our talks, today's session is going to be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. So with that, let me turn it over to Lydia and our panelists. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much, Sandy, and also welcome again to all of our panelists. I'm so excited to have you guys here and to hear more about the work you guys are up to. The first question that I have for all of you, I want all of you to answer, but I'll go ahead and ask Mishi to answer it first, is what sparked you and your group to head to the front lines to fight for education justice?
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I was on mute. My name is Mishi, pronouns she, her, goddess. I'm at Florida Student Power Network, and I'm excited to be with all of you in the space this afternoon. And so just to talk a little bit about it, education justice has been a trademark issue within our organization since our founding back in 2016. Our organization started in 2016 during the Trump-Clinton presidential election. And after organizing young people across the state, education justice became a priority issue within our organization in 2017 because our base was ramped up and ready to work around education justice issues and education justice problems that were happening in Florida during the time. In 2017, we focused on police-free schools and the Counselors Not Cop campaign between 2017 and 2019. And the attacks on youth voices in Florida have moved us towards school board accountability work in 2023 and community protection that protects spaces for Black, Brown, and queer youth in high school, colleges, and universities across the state. So we focus on education justice because we know that it's an intersectional issue and it has huge implications for young people across Florida. I mean, Florida is a state where racism is being fueled through our education legislation, where homophobia is rampant and harms queer youth in our legislation and our curriculum. And in 2022, when we noticed that the Don't Say Gay bill, the Stop Woke Act, were being inactive, it proved why education justice needed to be a priority for our organization. We had a track record on working on it, and it just provided more fuel and ammunition to continue the education justice fight. We needed to prioritize it, and in order to protect our base and our people at Florida Student Power, specifically because our youth are Black, Brown, queer, and they wanted campaigns that made Florida better for them. So we know we needed to focus on education justice.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I have so many thoughts and follow-up questions, but I know we need to keep moving. So I'm going to go ahead and pitch that same question to you, Cheaton. So what sparked you and your group to head to the front lines of fight for education justice?
Yeah, great question. First, hi, Cheaton, he, him pronouns from the Seattle Student Union. We were founded in 2022 in March off of seeing our schools not being closed despite a huge outbreak of COVID in Seattle Public Schools, where we were seeing teachers calling out sick to a point where staff couldn't make their lesson plans because they had to fill in for teachers. And we decided, there are students and teachers out sick. We need to close schools because it can be an infection ground for people. And so that was our first protest that we had, just for COVID safety. And then we moved on after we won N95 masks for every school to do a lot of work with our partners at Washington Ethnic Studies to advocate for and eventually implement the ethnic studies curriculum in Seattle Public Schools. And then this is our second year also hosting our Black Lives Matter at School Week, which partners with the Teachers Union and Seattle Public Schools in order to put on community events at local high schools and middle schools, as well as, in the classroom and in the curriculum, focusing on Black excellence and Black leaders throughout history. And in addition, with education justice, we have to make sure that our schools are safe. And so we've advocated for more counselors in schools, more therapists in schools, and of course, gun violence prevention.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Mateo, now I'm going to throw the question back at you. What sparked you and your group to head to the front lines and fight for education justice?
So hi, I'm Mateo Penado. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. And in Spanish, I also use ella pronouns. I'm a member of the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition and also founder of the Rainbow Collective, or a grassroots organization. So I know I and other youth and young adults saw the very quickly rampant and rising of anti-LGBTQ and youth legislation, not just across the nation, but it started directly hitting home in our home state of Georgia with bills like SB 140, SB 141, and then SB 88, which was actually a copycat of the Don't Say Gay bill. And then the voucher bill, SB 2233, which was using public state funds and allocating them to private schools. So ultimately, our existence as trans and queer, Black and brown and poor students was being directly impacted, and we needed to change that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Actually, I want to pull on that a little bit more. So across the country, we've seen this rise, and Misha, you talked about this too, in anti-LGBTQ efforts. How's that affecting your community? What are you seeing on the ground, and what are you sort of like, as this year has passed, how has that changed, and where do you think it's going next in your community? Mateo, I'll ask you that first.
So what I saw within my local North Georgia region community was just a lot of students are scared. They're scared of being able to be themselves, of being able to just function as students, and how are they going to be able to continue on in their day-to-day lives when all of this legislation is directly attacking them and their existence, and also going to be directly impacting, again, their day-to-day lives. Like the SB 88 Don't Say Copycat bill here in Georgia was going to also impact how we address students with their gender identity and names in school. So quite literally, as to how we even address ourselves and how we get addressed at school. So it's just these direct attacks at very marginalized communities. And I noticed that a lot of people were, quite frankly, fed up, and they wanted to take direct action, and started to do so with getting involved in organizing however they could, whether that be remote with doing like online activism and calling in their legislators, or directly going to their legislators at the Capitol.
That's so powerful. And I'm glad that you're seeing students really take that power and take that how frustrating that experience must be. I'm glad that they have people like you and groups like the Rainbow Collective and the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition to go to help turn that frustration into power and something meaningful. Mishi, I know you addressed something similar, so I wanted to bounce that question to you before we move on. Just about what the context has looked like for you with the rise in anti-LGBTQ efforts, what that looks like in your community and where you think that's going.
Right. And so I think Mateo really talked about folks being amped up and ready to fight, specifically in Florida. I know all eyes are Florida right now, and a lot of folks currently know about the legislation that's been pushed through our legislature around, removing, understanding of queer characters and queer folks in the curriculum, the direct attack on um, queer youth in schools, as well as like the attack on drag performances and the way that's being used as like a political tool from our legislature and our current leaders in Florida, right? To not only like attack youth, but just attack the community in general. I mean, we're in a state where like there's been like a huge history of attacking queer folks, right? When we look at like the amount of death that's happened in our state against queer youth, against the policing of queer folks as well, folks are angry. And we saw that specifically this year in 2023, when we saw the amount of folks that mobilized during our legislative session to kind of show that folks are watching what's happening at the legislature and we're strategizing on how we can take Florida back, or at least remove the folks who are harming our communities in the state in 2024. And so as we're building in our community, we're having those conversations. We know that what's happening in Florida right now is activating a lot of people. We don't want to lose that momentum. We know folks are activated, but now we want folks to organize with us. And we know organizing is slow and strategic. And we want to make sure folks understand that, right? Let's not forget the moment. Let's organize together so that we can fix a lot of the things that are happening. And I think that's where a lot of the conversations are moving right now in our community among youth. And it's exciting to see because we know 2024 is going to be a huge opportunity for young people to show up during elections and actually change a lot of the things that are currently happening in Florida.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. And then, so from Florida all the way to Washington, I think you couldn't geographically get further away and still be within the continental United States at least. Jaden, what kinds of ripple effects are you seeing like as this movement is happening across the country? What's that look like for you in Washington? I imagine different.
Yeah, I think particularly related to the things that are happening in Florida and Georgia. A lot of our members here in Seattle Union are frustrated, and sometimes they feel like they're hopeless, that they can't do anything in those states, even though they know that there are, youth there that, need a voice, and these organizations here really provide that voice. And so kind of in Washington State, we're really lucky to have a Democrat-controlled legislature that is friendly towards LGBTQ plus communities. And in Seattle particularly, we're lucky to have, a city council and a King County council that's also very friendly towards the LGBTQ plus community. But, in other places in Washington State, it's not like that. It's not like that in Eastern Washington and Spokane, in the Tri-Cities area, or in down south in Puyallup, right? It's different, because Seattle is a very progressive city. And then you go outside of Seattle and you see the disparities in the way that the LGBTQ plus community is treated in school boards across the state.
Thanks for sharing that context. So moving forward, so let's hear a little bit about each of your group's student organizing strategies. And from that kind of dark moment where we talked about anger and things, how have you turned that into victory as people are showing up to do things? I'm going to start that question with you, Mateo.
So I know something that Georgia Youth Justice Coalition does, which I think is very brilliant. And to me was also new, is they have this communications-based campaign of shifting the narrative, and they ultimately enable youth to kind of take their narrative in their own hands and to help also teach them how is it that we can go out into our own communities to help inform them, and challenge and change the way people are thinking of these topics from the get-go, and to also enable action from that thinking. So it's like from different things of like talking with reporters, being able to learn also how to write our own op-eds. And I know like for me who lives in Gainesville, which is a North Georgia kind of rural community, it's really effective because you see a lot of community members really like utilize the newspaper a lot and they still really heavily rely on those kind of newspaper and relying on their community leaders to learn about what's happening and to partake in actions. So when we write our op-eds and things like that, that really does help to kind of again shift this narrative, and for us to be able to not just shift the narrative but also shift what's happening and do these actions and change what's happening as well.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up. I know a couple, maybe, I don't know how long ago, 3 months ago now, a peer of yours, Hyla Daly, wrote this really great op-ed. I'm going to find it and drop it in the chat in a minute. But yeah, no, thank you so much for bringing that up. And it's so inspiring. That op-ed was so meaningful, even to me, who does not live in Georgia. So I'm really glad to hear that folks around there are reading and loving those as much as I do. Rishi, I'm going to throw that question to you. Tell us a little bit about the Florida Student Power Network's organizing strategies and some of the victories you've had.
Right. So at Florida Student Power, our organizing currently exists in 3 buckets. We currently do a lot of work during legislative session. We do a lot of work during elections. And then we also have our campaigns that are spread out across, we have 3 to 5 year plans for each of our campaigns at our organization that we work on when we're not doing legislative session as well as election work. With what's currently happening in Florida against Black, Brown, queer, and working class people, we know that we need to build people power right now, long term, in order to change and win. Sometimes it feels like we're not winning, but we know that our people power wins, the way that we're building momentum, the way that we're connecting with young people on the ground and bringing them towards our movement. We know we're slowly getting to where we need to be in order to change Florida. And so some wins that we've had at our organization, as well as, I mean, across the state, across youth organizations as Florida, is the way that we were able to mobilize around education justice and around the attacks on queer folks at the Capitol this year. In particular, at our organization, we were able to move more than 40 people to the Capitol to fight against HB 999, as well as other legislation that were impacting youth. We were also able to train 180 young people during this legislative session alone, and engage more than 300 young people with activations during legislative session. Currently, we're working on building out our membership, and we've onboarded 23 youth members to organize Florida in a volunteer capacity through our summer organizing program. And we know that they're going to do amazing work when it comes to the electoral changes that we need to make in Florida, as well as the electoral activations that we need in order to turn young people out and flip what's happening in Florida. And just some wins that have happened across the state. Not only did our organization mobilize and bring out youth during legislative session, but we know that like the LGBTQ plus community mobilized heavily during legislative session as well. I know that was a movement. Something that brought me so many joy was when there was a drag march to the Capitol, which was extremely powerful to see in person, and to show, resistance when a lot of legislation are impacting queer folks, are impacting youth as well. And so there was a drag march that was extremely successful. There was also a lot of other organizations and student organizations that mobilized around the education policies as well, which was a huge win. And we know that that's only going to continue building. So we're in a very important moment right now, especially for youth organizing in Florida. And there's a lot of opportunity next year for us to have some tangible wins when it comes to expanding our youth electorate and activating folks to take action to flip a lot of the things that are happening.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. I know people talk about Florida as if it's some kind of lost cause. Clearly, they don't know anyone from Florida because there's so many great and powerful young people doing such impressive and important things down there. So really, really appreciate you for doing that and for sharing it with us today. Chayton, now the question to you. Tell us a little bit about Seattle Student Union's organizing strategy and some of your victories.
Yeah, so as I said, we started last year off of an Instagram group chat, organizing for KN95 masks, and glad to have achieved that. I'm going in timeline order. After we worked on that, our next big project was working and shifting the focus after the Uvalde shooting to gun violence prevention. Every year we have a student-made policy platform in which we set priorities for our organization. And last year it happened to be gun violence prevention and student mental health. Something we've always advocated for over the past year and a half is funding youth mental health across Seattle. Right now we hear stories in Seattle of students taking 2 or 3 months to get a therapist or counselor through their school-based health centers because there's just not enough staff and not enough resources. And that's just one of the problems that Washington State has with the public education system. From there, we staged 2 GVP protests, our first one being a sort of press conference after the Uvalde shooting, and the second one, unfortunately, in November, an Ingram student in Seattle was shot and killed at their school due to student-on-student violence. And from there, our Seattle Student Union leapt into action, organizing a protest where we had over 2,500 people attend, in which 2,000 marched in the streets of Seattle to a city hall and back. And from those demands, we worked with the city council in order to fund $4.5 million for student mental health services in Seattle public schools, and have that implementation model be the first of its kind because it's student-led. The implementation model goes to the schools that need the most resources, particularly our South End schools, and ask, what do you need? Do you need a student mental health counselor? Do you need programs for this to improve mental health? What do you need? And so that's a really innovative approach that we're trying to implement. During legislative session for us this year, it was from January to April 24th. And this year we had a wild set of victories built off of the gun violence prevention movement in Washington State for the past 15 years. 15 years ago in Washington State, after a shooting in Mukilteo, Washington, lawmakers wanted to do something about gun violence in their communities. And then a group of Democrats actually came out with a public letter to the Speaker of the House and said, do not introduce this because we will veto it. Keep in mind, we had a majority Democrat legislature in the time. And so it's astonishing to see now, this year, we hosted a youth lobby day with over 100 people at the Capitol, and met with over 20 legislators, state senators and state representatives and their staff. And we were able to achieve the largest gun violence prevention package in history with our partners at Everytown, at the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, including the assault weapons ban, which bans all sale of assault weapons, and then also a structure for a permit to purchase model, which isn't fully implemented but was halfway through, as well as keeping industries accountable for the gun industry in particular, accountable for the injuries and deaths they cause. Just like on a child's toy, there's a label warning saying if your child eats this, they could be the parent could sue if it's harmful in the most extravagant way. The same thing needs to be held to the gun industry. So making sure that they're held accountable to the same standards as everybody else. And building off of that this year, one of our most recent victories is establishing an endorsement board, because we know that electoral power is power. And so making sure that we have, electoral power in order to support candidates that want to fund youth mental health, that want to stop gun violence in our communities, is something that's really important to our organization.
Thanks for sharing that. We just got a question in through our Q&A feature. So I want to remind all attendees that you can put a question in the Q&A feature. But I think it's really apt and sort of leads us off of that last question. As you talked about some of your victories, where have you found the most resistance in your social change work? And have you found any unlikely allies in your work? That's to anyone.
I can kind of begin with the question. Most resistance in social change work, I think in Florida right now, if we're looking at the landscape, the most resistance is currently from our elected officials. I think a lot of folks back in 2018 really didn't understand the impacts that electing our current governor would have on the state. And then after seeing the way that our we're slowly been we've slowly been chipping at our legislature, we have a supermajority that's been pushing a lot of legislation. A lot of folks are realizing that that was the issue. And many times we've also seen the way that our elected officials have ignored community, ignored folks, ignored the way that folks have expressed their concerns to push their own agendas and to line their own pockets. And so they've been the ones most resistant to our social change movement. However, in terms of unlikely allies, especially for young people, I think in terms of education, we've realized that teachers really do care about their students. I really want to uplift teachers as an ally because they've been the ones fighting the curriculum changes that has been happening in education. They've been the ones also advocating for the need for safe spaces for queer youth in schools. They've been testifying, showing up, and sharing the reasoning why the legislation that's been currently moving in Florida isn't right for youth. And I find that very hopeful. I find that very important to note as well because they have been really showing up for young people, and I want to uplift that. They not only have they been impacted, but they've been advocating a lot for students and youth, especially folks who are directly impacted by those issues.
For sure, for sure. Chayton or Matea, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest resistance is the Washington State Legislature has an interesting dynamic because while we believe in a lot of policy work and doing all the right things policy-wise, we have a hard time coming up with the funding to fund that policy work. And that is something that is really, it's been really hard for Washington State because to give a landscape on our revenue, we do not have an income tax. So no one is taxed for any of the income that they make. We have recently put a capital gains tax on the top 1% in Washington State. So that's brought in a lot of money. And in Seattle, in particular, we have something called the Jumpstart tax, which taxes businesses and basically the richest of rich businesses. So the Amazons, the Googles, the Adobes, things like that. We introduced a bill with the Office of Public Instruction of Washington State in the last legislative session, which focused on increasing support for mental health services across the state, and which provided new and allocated funding for that. And the legislature was unable to pass that because they could not muster up the money to pass that. They did not think it was because of the landscape of revenue services, they did not feel like they were comfortable spending the money. And so unfortunately, a lot of that is where are we going to find that money, right? And so that means taking it from other services that are essential. So it's a lot. And so we've been working with the state to come up with new revenue resources, which has been great. That's been the toughest resistance. I think unexpected allies, especially on student mental health, Republicans have actually been very supportive of our policies on student mental health for the wrong reasons, but they have been because they don't a lot, especially when we're in the argument of gun violence prevention, they believe it's mental health, not the gun. And so we take a two-prong approach where it can be both, right? Like we can provide more mental health services to students and young people in order to stop the violence from occurring, but we also need to stop them from getting a weapon. And so that's our two-pronged approach of how we're actually, going to solve this public health issue.
Thanks for sharing. Mateo, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I think here in Georgia, what we've seen is biggest opposition have been, quite frankly, those lobbying groups. Can't remember the exact names right now, but they're the ones that have been pushing for this heavy anti-LGBTQ and youth legislation to pass. The lobbying groups for the conservative, very religious ones, but also the private schooling lobbying groups, specifically for the voucher bill SB 233 that we saw. And also kind of following what Michi said is also these representatives that aren't following what their community and their actual like constituents are wanting. And they're instead falling in line with maybe what the party, the Republican Party, or whatever their party is, despite what their constituents are heavily advocating for, which is the rights for students, rights for youth, and rights for LGBTQ individuals. And what I've been seeing in grassroots organizing, a very unlikely ally, I think, for trans and queer people is actually sometimes these faith-based organizations. I've seen a lot of like faith-based parent support groups come out, and they have been some of the most supportive folks out there, wanting to provide as much support and as much help as they can for the community.
That's so interesting. It's not the first time I've heard something like that. We had an office hour on LGBTQ organizing in Forsain a while back, and some folks from Kentucky were there. I'm from Kentucky too, full disclosure. And lots of folks from Kentucky are talking about how there are like queer like folks in churches that who are already doing this like community building work and are building these really supportive spaces for LGBTQ folks in particular. So this is a good sort of segue to my next question, which is about what do we want to tell to adult allies? There are lots of adult allies on this call, myself included. What's the best piece of advice that you could give to an adult ally who wants to support LGBTQ youth in their communities? Or maybe if there's a time that you've received some really helpful adult support, what that looked like for you. And again, anyone can go for that.
Yeah, I can start. I'm just gonna take it back because I always think that this is really helpful and really emphasizing the fact that LGBTQ plus youth need space in order to thrive, and they also need, supports like mental health support if they so desire it. And what that looks like for me is, I grew up in North Carolina in a small town with like 20,000 people. And, growing up, I've seen, people older than me getting bullied because they were LGBTQ plus. And so providing that space, for one, being able to talk those feelings out, and two, being able to, engage in restorative justice. A lot of counselors do that in schools in Seattle. And so that would be really helpful. And in addition, advocating always for, federal policies that would protect LGBTQ plus youth, because we can do things on the state level and that's great. However, federal support is also needed in order to solve this, in order to feel like LGBTQ plus youth are safe.
Yeah, and I don't mind going after. The advice, and I'm speaking from a Florida perspective. I know, Lydia, you shared how folks have been losing hope in Florida. And since folks have been losing hope in Florida, that's been significantly decreasing the resources that we have to actually do the work here in this state. And so the advice I have for adult allies is fund the work to make it happen, as simple as that. Because in Florida, the people working against us are not only heavily organized, they're heavily funded. And even though folks have lost hope in the South because of what's been going on, removing funding as a way of support is not the answer. We actually need even more resources to fight back and win. And in order for us to build power, We know that we're building on the ground, we're building our movement, we're bringing people in. Another portion of that power that we need is resources, in order for us to create space, in order for us to build, in order for us to fight. And so the advice that I have is fund the work, support organizations. Doing this work by, through your monetary support. And then as you do that, showing up alongside us when we show up at the legislature, when we show up at school board meetings, when we show up on the ground. We know that folks are going to do that regardless, right? We know that folks are going to share posts on social media and talk about Florida regardless. Let's get the funding necessary in order for us to actually fight with strategy and actually take the power back from our opponents.
Oh, I love that so much. I'm sitting over here literally looking on Zoom for the reaction things. I want to like applaud or like exclamate like or something, but I can't find it because I'm a grandpa. But no, I could not agree more. Thank you so much for that perspective. Mateo, what about you?
I think there are several different ways adults and allies can show up in LGBTQ youth and LGBTQ youth organizers' lives and in our movement. Yes, most definitely please fund and give us material resources. Southern trans and queer folk deserve those resources and that funding now more than ever, because although some people may have lost hope, we have not. We are still continuing the fight regardless. Whether those funds are drying out or not, we're still trying to make that work happen regardless. Even if it's like, for example, sometimes I have to fund my own stuff and I don't mind because this is work for the community and this is work that we all desperately need to do. But yeah, funding, giving material resources, but also accompanying us to actions and helping to kind of make space for us when it is necessary. And it can even be things like helping us fill out the city permits for protests and actions like that, driving us down to the Capitol to lobby. Yes, it just depends on like finding that avenue of where you can help somebody in their life and in their organizing.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think a great place that I've heard from other places, drawing back to that same office hour we had before, was to just go with folks to stuff, especially because I know there's some counter protesting. Sometimes there are other adults that show up to make queer youth feel unsafe, and there's nothing better than adult ally to be there to be in the way of that. I think that's really important as well. So sort of, Mateo, I want to pose this question to you because it pulls on what you were just talking about. But when you're talking to young LGBTQ students who are ready to organize, what kind of inspiration and guidance are you sharing with those folks?
I think it's so important for us to remember that first it has to come for a love of our community. Yes, that's what's most important, is that we're organizing for our community, ourselves, and also recognize the fact that a revolution in a movement is not going to take a day. It is going to take a little while for us to see the fruits of our labor, but so long as we stay consistent and we continue to have this drive, but also this revolutionary hope and love for each other, we are definitely going to see queer and trans liberation in our lifetime.
Wow, that was so. I'm ready to go now. You've inspired me. Mishi or Chetan? I give a reminder of the question. It was, what do you say to young LGBTQ students who are ready to organize? What kind of inspiration and guidance do you share with them?
Yeah, I was gonna add in. I think for me as someone who's Gen Z, we need to move beyond social media and focus more on strategy. And this was something that I had to learn as I became an organizer, as I became someone working for Florida Student Power. I think, people often think that young people don't care, right? But then, like, when we look at social media and we see how folks are responding to things that they're seeing, on Instagram or on TikTok as they're going through TikTok, right? Like, people are angry and fed up. And I would love for us to begin, taking that frustration that we show online and showing up in community. Because organizing, as much as I love digital organizing, right? we need to be having community conversations and being in person, moving a lot as this work in order for us to move on our strategy and to actually win and fight back. I think there's a reason why like our opponents and the folks who are fighting against us aren't on social media as much, right? Like we see a lot of the things that are impacting our community, right? In media, like in media itself, or in our communities themselves, right? And I think we need to turn that same on our end, right? That same frustration that we show online to our organizing in person. And so the advice that I have, right, is we need more people in our movement. We need creative, strategic plans to win. And we need people to show up in person in community to build out a better future for our people. So let's not focus too much on the spotlight that we have on social media, but begin having those community connections that can allow us to build out strategy and win.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Chetan, what about you?
Ooh, yeah. It's a great question. I think two things. One, it's really important to, especially when wanting to make change, it can seem like if you're in, for example, I don't know, I'm going to use North Carolina as an example. And when you're in North Carolina, if you're in the more like conservative part, you can feel very disconnected from other organizers and folks. And so my advice there would be to, get connected with folks, get connected, create coalitions, because that's how you get stuff done. When we're all communicating with each other across the state, across the country, we can share strategies and organizing tactics that work in other areas. And so can apply to your area as well. And so making sure that you're really connected with other organizers is really, really important in order to make change. And then two, just echoing, be patient, be persistent. Change is hard and change can take time, but it is worth it. A lot of the work that you're doing matters. And even though it can be really exhausting at times and it looks like things aren't getting done, you're building that power, you're building the volunteer base, you're building your networks, you're building, when it is attainable, when you do the community work, you'll be able to mobilize and really make it happen.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We got another question in the Q&A box. Reminder to all our participants that you can submit a question via the Q&A box. And this question is actually a much better worded one than my next question anyway. So I was very excited to get it. I'm just going to read it. So it's from Isabella, and it says, question for all the organizers here, but especially to Michi. Oh, sorry, Mishi. My coworker moved it to answer it and then it disappeared. Anyway, question for other organizers here, but especially to Mishi because of the situation in Florida. How do you keep up morale and community unity among the queer youth in these dark times when victory seems like such an unattainable thing? So Mishi, if you want to go ahead and start with that.
Yes, definitely. And I love this question because we had the opportunity to think about it a little bit. I think the first one is uplifting our wins and showing people that we can win through planning and bringing people into our strategy. And the reason why I say that is because at our organization specifically, we seek to center Black, Brown, working class youth, right, in our movement. And a lot of the times, something that we say at our organization is that organizing is a privilege. It's something that is very inaccessible to a lot of people. And so when they see a lot of the attacks that are happening on their own community, especially queer youth, directly impacted Black and Brown youth, they don't know that they can fight back and win because they don't have access to organizing, campaign planning, and strategy around them, right, to know that they could. And so what we seek to do is that we seek to uplift our wins and share that with folks. And also in the way that we're bringing people into our movement, making sure we center the most marginalized people and uplift their stories. And so we make sure that we're collecting stories, uplifting our wins, even those small wins, the way that we frame our wins, right? We know that we're losing a lot when it comes to the policy side, but how are we building that movement? We're showing how we're bringing people together and how young people are rallied up and ready to fight. And we're also exposing young folks to the mechanisms that are creating the problems, and then also showing them the mechanisms that can solve the problems and actually allow us to win. And then I think the last thing that I wanted to share around how we can bring up morale is just for example, at our organization, we make sure that we center healing justice and create space um, for our people. We Organizing is tedious work. I mean, not only, in organizing, a lot of us are impacted by the issues that we're fighting for. And so it's hard to remove yourself, right? As you're like kind of fighting those issues, right? It's hard to remove yourself, and I'm speaking from experience. And so we make sure that we center healing justice through our political education, through the way that we're building power, through the way that we're building our membership right, so that we're able to create safe spaces for young folks to feel refreshed to do the work and amped up, even as we're constantly being attacked. And we do that in multiple of ways. We do it a lot of different ways, but healing justice in the terms that we're centering self-care, the way that we're centering community care and community connections, being with one another, is the way that we bring up morale and make sure folks not don't feel that we're losing, but see us as making progressive uh, movement towards our end goal within the next 3 to 5 years.
That's so important. I don't know if I assume that you have met Marley English with the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition. This is something that they talk about all the time, community care and how important that is in organizing. So if you don't know them, I Mateo could probably make an introduction, but that's so important. Mateo, do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, I love community care, and I love centering community care within the work that I do, and within the work that we are doing at the moment. And I think just honoring the fact when, yes, organizing can be very tedious and it can be very labor intensive, and just recognizing when y'all need to take rest, because you can't keep on doing the work if you're so tired and burnt out as well. So I know, like with the Rainbow Collective, while we've been doing a couple of actions, a lot of the members were asking that we take maybe June, the Pride Month off, and are able to celebrate and have a celebratory action. And so I know, like 28th on Pride Day, that's what we'll be doing. We'll be having a Pride Day celebration in action, but also it's a very cheesy kind of line, but I think now more than ever it is true. Trans and queer joy is resistance, especially when your very existence as a trans and queer person is being targeted at the moment. So just also honoring those moments of joy.
Thank you so much for sharing that. What about you, Chayton?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. The first thing I would say, to keep morale and community unity high, what I like to do, one, definitely making sure that the work that we do is distributed equitably among folks. Not equally equitably is always my saying, because some people may have more capacity than others because of situational factors in their personal lives, in their professional lives, things like that. And also with our volunteer base, making sure, and this is the point that I like to hone in a lot too. A lot of us are kids. We're folks that are still developing. We also have to put on this organizing work that's extremely tiring, that a lot of adults get tired from as well, right? So making sure that we have activities that are like good for you, right? So that are good for the health and well-being of our community and of our volunteers, and also just celebratory fun events, honestly. Like this Sunday, we'll be marching in the Pride Parade for Seattle, making sure that LGBTQ plus youth are seen. And so that's just one of the many things that we do in order to keep our morale high. Also, food always helps.
Food does help, and I know people love to show up when you've got food at your event. Okay, that's all great. I have one more question for you guys, which is, it's Pride Month, right? So who is an LGBTQ historical figure, or present day change maker who inspires you? And this is open to everyone.
I can get us started. I think it's always important for us to uplift Black queer figures and especially Black trans figures. And so definitely wanting to talk about Marsha P. Johnson and the Stonewall riots as an organizer in a moment that's important for us to uplift every Pride Month, right? Especially when it comes to what's happening to Black trans folks currently. So definitely want to talk about that, but then also don't want to forget modern folks who I look up to in Florida that folks can also do some research and look into. So Valencia Gunder is a queer climate activist in Florida that's been doing a lot of work and has been fighting for Black queer folk for the longest. Love the work that Valencia has done in Florida, and also Jasmine Rogers as a fighter for Black women in Florida, and also as a queer person has been doing some awesome work in uplifting the intersections of racism, criminal justice in Florida. And so if folks could research them and also support the work that they're doing actively for queer folks, that would be great. And I'll pass it off.
Yes, Mishi. Also, can you write those names in the chat? I'm taking notes, but I'm not sure I got everything.
Someone that inspires me a lot is Sylvia Rivera, who's also a Stonewall veteran, and I believe she also was used to be in the Young Lords organization, which I recently found out, and I thought was super amazing, and also explained a lot about her persistence and just how disciplined she is or was with her organizing efforts. And she was a Latina trans woman, and being a Latino trans man, opposite sides of the spectrum, but it's been very inspiring to see how outspoken and very blunt she was in trying to take care of her community that she very much loved deeply. And again, community care is something that guides me a lot and the work that I do. And I think now there are a lot of amazing Black and Brown and also immigrant trans leaders and organizers that do a lot of very good work. I know here in Georgia, there's orgs like Trans Power and Diversity and Community Estea, which is led by Leanne Sanchez, and other orgs like that that should also definitely get their dues and their flowers.
Awesome. Put all those in the chat. Thank you so much, Mateo. And last but not least, Kitten.
I think Outer Lord is definitely one of my favorites. She was a Black feminist civil rights activist who often took to writing to express her views. And she honestly is an inspiration to me, especially in that time where she, expressed opinions through her writing that weren't popular, but that still to this day are timeless and have influence on the work that we do.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask you to put them in the chat as well. And then I just want to say to everyone, thank you so much for coming and joining us today. And thanks again to our panel of just the most amazing student leaders. I know that all of us I speak for everyone when I say we're so glad that you had the opportunity to come and share all of your insights with us. A recording of today's session will be available by the end of the week on our YouTube channel, where you can also find all of our other learning community talks. And if you would like to learn more about See Common Ground Student Action Network for Equity, feel free to reach out to us via email. Our emails are in the chat. Mine is just lydia@seecommonground.org, so it's pretty easy. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us today. Have a happy Pride, and we hope to see you all soon.